everybody. We're joined today by Dr. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi, a senior lecturer in the history of the Middle East, to discuss the past year or so of conflict in the Middle East, particularly the role of Iranian foreign policy and its connections to the Israeli escalation in the past month as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here.
Great. So my first question to you is that we've witnessed an escalation, obviously, significantly in the past month or so. Israel has ramped up its genocidal policies in Palestine. But I want you to take us a little bit before that for immediately after, basically, Operation Al-Aqsa flood in October 7, 2023, until late September, there seemed to be a kind of defined rules of engagement. And I was wondering if you can give us an overview of your analysis of the Iranian government's policies during that whole time and how they kind of went about responding to the conflict.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I think there are very good grounds to believe that obviously Iran did not have any foreknowledge of the Operation Al-Aqsa flood. Ayatollah Khamenei came out very quickly, which is unusual actually for him, and denied any foreknowledge of that, and said this was very much the work of the Palestinians themselves. More recently, very recently, the New York Times has published an article actually trying to intimate that Iran was very much in the know. I don't really think that report really holds much water, and even on their own terms, it doesn't show that Iran had any detailed knowledge whatsoever of the time, place, and means to which it would be carried out. So I think that's good just to clarify. And then from very quickly, very early on, obviously, when Israel obviously began its bombardment and invasion and what is now a genocide in Gaza, shortly after October 7th began, as far as we know, it seems that Iran was working very closely with Hezbollah, obviously, to put considerable pressure on Israel to its north. To the end of obviously drawing Israeli forces away from Gaza itself, and taking a number of actually Israeli divisions and sort of preoccupying there. At this point, I think hundreds of Hezbollah fighters have been killed, and they've actually stopped now publishing the names of the casualties. So I think the point was very much one of a policy, maybe of attrition, of actually trying to draw Israeli material, military resources, wherewithal, etc., without risking a full-blown regionalization of the conflict. I think Iran was very aware very early on that the United States was directly involved in this, in the conflict, would actually, to a large extent, very much would support kind of the course of action pursued in Gaza specifically, and potentially against Lebanon and Iran and so on going forward. So I think there was a clear awareness of that, and sort of the Iranian state has adopted for a while now this policy of strategic patience, as they call it. So not actually pursuing a direct escalatory conflict with either Israel or the United States. So that was very much the line that was pursued. Obviously, this shifted. There was a significant shift following the Israeli bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which killed as many as 16 people, including 7 members, sort of senior commanders in the Revolutionary Guard. One of these in particular was sort of the point man for the Quds force in the Levant. I think it's Brigadier General Zahedi. And obviously in response to that, then Iran launched its True Promise 1, which was this quite elaborate swarm attack that was telegraphed weeks in advance used a lot of older equipment, such as drones, cruise missiles, and also used a number of ballistic missiles. I mean, there's often even a misunderstanding, I think, when some people analyze this. So they sort of say, oh, this is just performative, or this was just for show, and so on and so forth. Given that obviously there was this international coalition, as well as, the Israeli sort of defense systems, shot many of these down. However, a number of ballistic missiles did, even in this first iteration, strike the Nevatim airbase, and that was really the key point. I mean, that was the message that was being sent. And I think the Iranian leadership assumed that this would be sufficient to sort of re-establish the rules of engagement, which obviously it didn't quite work out that way, however.
Thank you. And actually, you anticipated my next question, because that very point, I think, has become a matter of debate. And there's no way to know for sure, of course, but there's this idea that the Iranian government and Hezbollah, but particularly the Iranian government, underestimated or misread the fact that this deterrence that had been established had been completely thrown out the window with October 7th, and that there was, in the minds of the Israeli decision makers, a chance for total war, a chance to drag the US into the war. And, you remember that dynamic where supposedly the US was giving the bear hug to allow Israel and turn the other way when, they were carrying out the massive bombardment in Gaza, but also to prevent a regional war. Do you think the Iranian government mistook or underestimated this desire? Do you think that Israel saw this all along and kind of had been planning for it, and therefore there was nothing that Iranian government could have done differently? What's your take on this kind of debate that's emerged as a result of the significant escalation over the past month?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty plausible to me, to be honest. Yeah, I don't basically think that Iran's leadership, or even as far as I can understand, as I can gather, the Hezbollah leadership prior to the assassination of Said Hassan Nasrallah, were eager to actually see a full-blown regional war. And I think they also assumed that that basically the United States to some extent would restrain the Israeli state up to a point. But also, I think we need to remember that the US very, very early on, deployed major warships and aircraft carriers to the region, basically saying Iran that they will only countenance so much of an escalation. So there was very much like a measured, considered balancing act that they were trying to strike. Iran and Hezbollah, I think. And obviously both countries, obviously Lebanon far more so, but face quite fragile economic conditions, at home. So obviously Hezbollah actually initiated engagement with Israel in the north. And they did that obviously out of solidarity and for various other reasons, to, like I said, to, in a sense, put pressure on Israeli forces. But they were also, very mindful of not, of only going up to a certain point. I guess also because they're very just aware from past engagements that Israel is willing to, especially in Lebanon, obviously, and as it has gone on to do so, is willing to just engage in wanton destruction of not just military assets, but civilian infrastructure, and punish and engage in collective punishment of the entire population. And we even saw that threat very early on, famously, by Gallant, who was saying, who mentioned, we know what to do, and the Dahi doctrine and all these sorts of things, which have been spoken about quite a lot. Similarly, Iran had elected by the summer a new president. And we can talk about that in a bit. But I do think there was this calculation, I think, that the conflict could be up to a point contained to Gaza, obviously with all of the horrible and catastrophic consequences for the people, for the Palestinians and people in Gaza, of course. But I think Iran and Hezbollah weren't, were rational, actually, at least based on prior engagements to a significant point, with themselves, not necessarily of Israeli contact in the Palestinian, in Israel or Palestine, but with the sort of prior rules of engagement that had been pursued both with Hezbollah and also with Iran. But it does seem, they did underestimate. They did, in my view, I mean, for what it's worth, I think they underestimated the Netanyahu government's willingness to basically escalate and take big risks, or take risks, and the US's like unwillingness to kind of restrain the Israeli state. And it does seem that obviously, so with like the pager sort of terrorist attack, that in a sense, are coming off out of the 2006 war, that maybe there had been an underestimation of actually Israel's the advances in Israel's intelligence gathering kind of game here, and also the willingness to actually to use it. And then obviously, first I think, but the first kind of, I guess, intimations that the calculation was mistaken was, first of all, the bombing of the consulate, which was just, a really quite outrageous thing to have done. Then the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, like literally on the day of the inauguration of the new Iranian president. And then obviously the assassination and killing of Said Hassan Nasrallah in southern Beirut, along with, hundreds of other like innocents, basically. So yeah, it does seem that there was, to some extent, a miscalculation and an underestimation, especially given that, like, there were grounds to believe that the United States had previously intervened to stop the Israelis from like assassinating Nasrallah in the past. So it wasn't as if there wasn't some sort of historical grounds on which this was actually being based. But I think, all of us are learning increasingly that we can't take anything for granted with respect to the Israeli state, the United States, the quote unquote international community, and so on. And I mean, just to sort of reiterate, like Iran's tentativeness or sort of its careful consideration. I mean, right after True Promise 1, actually, Iranian diplomats, sort of top brass in the Iranian military, immediately said, if sort of Israel doesn't retaliate, we'll bring this kind of escalation will end. It will come to a close. And yeah, clearly, Netanyahu felt sufficiently emboldened just to continue to ramp up. Kind of to just continue to escalate and to do anything really to re-ascertain or to regain sort of escalation dominance, basically. And there actually was significant criticism in Iran itself after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, actually. And many who are sort of, devotees or sort of adherents and supporters of the government actually sort of said, and later criticized, that if the Iranian government had responded after Haniyeh's assassination, then maybe the Israelis wouldn't have actually have killed Nasrallah. So there was a debate even within Iran itself of how and when it should actually respond.
Well, let's perhaps talk a little bit about those internal conditions, because you mentioned in an article you published recently at the New Left Review, which had summarized, at least until most recent weeks, summarized the developments that were taking place. And one of the things you mentioned, it was that the current Iranian president had campaigned significantly on sanctions relief, and that this may have been a factor in restraining Iranian government reaction to those assassinations. Can you tell us a little bit more about the internal kind of political and economic and other dynamics that may have kind of conditioned the Iranian government's thinking? What are the kind of internal discussions looking like?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually don't think it's linked just to the election of Masoud Pezeshkian. Actually, I mean, so just to give some context, he sort of very much campaigned on various things. So very much kind of a loosening of cultural and various social restrictions, very much a kind of a greater sort of, liberalization around sort of the press and various things along this nature. But really the heart of his campaign was economic kind of growth, economic stability, greater prosperity, and all these sorts of things. This was sort of really the heart of his kind of promise and platform and pitch to the Iranian electorate. And he, on a number of occasions, he pointed to the devastating impact of sanctions, economic sanctions on Iran. So yeah, I'm sure your listeners are aware, but the sanctions obviously go back very, very early on to really on the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. But obviously, more recently, there was the Obama administration that really initially imposed quote unquote crippling sanctions on Iran to really sort of to quote a well-known, rather dubious American political figure, to make the economy sort of scream. And that was very much kind of the objective. And then in 2015, apologies, after the Rouhani administration was elected, then we have obviously the JCPOA, the famous kind of nuclear deal agreement, which ultimately in 2018 Trump reneged on, pulled out of, and then began what he called his maximum pressure campaign, which was really just an all-out campaign of economic warfare, really. And it wasn't just restricted to economic concerns either. It was like really kind of a full press of aggression on various fronts. But the economic one was very, very kind of crucial. And this was basically just continued by the Democrats, by the Biden administration. So that has had, a significant impact on people's well-being. I mean, millions of people have been plunged into poverty and are far, worse off because of it. And you can speak from direct experience. My family, who are really their quality of life is just it's just in many ways been massively detracted from, and has really in a poor state as a result of these policies. So that has given rise. There is widespread anger, frustration over the economic situation. So, I think, my point really is it's not really just restricted to Pezeshkian, because often in Western coverage, there's this sort of idea that, sometimes you get a reformist president and then he's kind of hindered by people in the political establishment who are quote unquote hardliners and so on and so forth. I mean, that's quite a simplistic, depiction of the situation. The reality is that I think a significant part actually of the political class in Iran understood that there needs to be kind of meaningful development on that front, and actually, and maybe that Pezeshkian was the person to be able to do it, and that being said, he obviously marked a significant shift from the previous Raisi administration, which did have a very different political outlook. But even in the Raisi's time, I mean, such things as, for instance, de-escalation with Saudi Arabia and various kind of diplomatic outreach to Saudi Arabia. I mean, that happened first under Ibrahim Raisi. It didn't happen under Pezeshkian. So things like this are quite notable. But Pezeshkian did make it, like I said, central to this idea, substantive engagement with the world, especially the European powers. Obviously, the US is still a bit of a red line for obvious reasons. And then, to be honest, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Trump administration and the Biden administration have vindicated the critics of the nuclear deal, who basically said you can't really trust the American administration. But there was, like I said, so the Pezeshkian government did want to kind of push this full press, and then there's carryover from the Rouhani administration. So Dr. Araghchi, who's now the current foreign minister, these people definitely wanted to do this. But then, when Pezeshkian went even to the UN, he was very, very sort of outspoken in his willingness to pursue this fact, of engagement, to pursue engagement in a serious way. But he just saw that he was very, no one really cared, and he was very much rebuffed. And all people really were concerned with was the Iran's position vis-a-vis the war on Gaza. Also, interestingly, I mean, this is just another thing I read this morning, but there's new polling data that was published, which does seem pretty reliable, which kind of shows that while a significant majority of Iranians might be might think that Iran's foreign policy is in large part responsible for a lot of their economic woes, actually, like a big majority, like 61%, actually think that Iran should have a proactive role in the region, and that Iran's sort of military presence and support for its allies in the region actually make, like 69% think it actually makes them safer. So there's kind of this like tension even amongst the Iranian public here, where they are dissatisfied with Iran being isolated. They want greater engagement with like Europe and the United States and these sorts of things. But at the same time, they're very aware that Iran's sort of relationships in the region, its allies in the region, its foreign policy is also a big reason for the security it's enjoyed when compared to, sort of neighboring states.
Thank you for that. That's good context to know, and especially the point about the fact that this is not this binary of moderates and hardliners that is often presented in the Western media, which already is a simplistic binary, but there's also a general understanding among the policy elite that conditions are becoming unbearable, and therefore the shift was needed. And that's why, as you said, there was these shifts that predated any of this, the kind of
yeah, I mean, they realize there's no interlocutor for
right.
meaningful engagement. You've just seen like the United States, Germany, Britain. I mean, there's complete. I mean, after despite all that Israel has done, and despite what it's done, what it's done in Gaza, what it's doing in Lebanon, the attacks on the Iranian consulate, so on and so forth. I mean, Iran then responds and gets sanctioned itself, despite not actually hurting any Israeli civilians. I mean, it's quite.
Well, that shows. I mean, I think that shows the Western infatuation with violence, and the fact that whatever hesitation they had was not due to any kind of logical, rational calculation, but the fact that they thought things might spiral out of control, and Israel is trying to convince them, no, that as the old Israeli saying goes, what cannot be solved by violence can be solved with even greater violence. So that's the Western embrace of that has been,
well, yeah, you even saw like the re kind of branding of these like really I don't know how to put it, like unhinged ideas about this is a golden opportunity to actually remake the Middle East and this quote unquote new Middle East, which has just been this like neoconservative like classic like liberal imperialist kind of narrative, which has been just so discredited. Always was obviously ridiculous, but it's just been discredited, and it cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But unfortunately, much of the policy and media class are willing to to acquiesce and just repeat this stuff. And you find even in broadsheets here in the UK, so the Times, which is supposedly meant to be reputable, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, just literally sort of saying that an Israeli strike can lead to a regime, which is just it's just sheer, it's just grounded in nothing. I mean, it's just delusion, nonsense. So yeah, there seems to be a lot of appetite still for that, despite all of the carnage that has been unleashed across the region, unfortunately.
Well, we had thought it was discredited, but many of those neocons are still walking around and taken seriously, and in fact have signed up to the Harris-Walz presidential campaign. So I wanted to ask you about that.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Yeah.
So we'll get to that in a second. But actually, before that, I wanted to then just take back one step and talk about the October 1st Iranian response, which in many ways was the first real major response by Iran that overstepped the previous kind of strategic deterrence, strategic patience, which, the dynamic that we had talked about. 180 or so ballistic missiles were launched. Initial reports, of course, downplayed them, but we now know that they did do significant damage to military bases, and they targeted the Mossad headquarters, which apparently was hidden among civilians in Tel Aviv. As the Western media likes to say.
Yeah,
yeah. But I mean, can you take us through the last basically, how things have shifted in your mind over the past few weeks and since that Iranian response, and maybe comment on those dynamics.
Sure, absolutely. So obviously following the assassination of Said Hassan Nasrallah, and obviously there was also a member of the Quds Force, General Abbas Nilfrushan, as well, who was killed in that attack. Iran responded by launching 200 more advanced ballistic missiles against two Israeli air bases and the Mossad headquarters. And we know, and I'm a historian, but I tried to read up a bit on the analysis from sort of arms control experts, and from the satellite imagery, it does seem that at least 40 missiles hit Nevatim Air Base alone, where the airstrike against Said Nasrallah was launched. Obviously, the impact and the degree to which they did damage to Israeli aircraft isn't really known. Limited knowledge of that. And obviously, there's Israeli military censorship and all these sorts of things, and there's a lot of bluster from the Israelis still. But we did see actually it was dampened, especially compared to the first time, and it just showed actually that the Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow system, all of these systems which cost billions and billions and billions and billions, often like U.S. taxpayers' money, and also U.S. arms manufacturers, were unable to counter this. And similarly with ballistic missiles, so the F-35s, which Israel is unable to shoot these down, they can't do anything about them. What was the US's response and Britain's response? It was actually to, first of all, impose sanctions on Iran more, despite the fact that it's Israel that is now, responsible for the death of, officially 42,000, but probably in excess of 200,000 people in Gaza, and then obviously over 2,500 or so in Lebanon at this point. Impose sanctions on Iran, and then actually commit to provide Israel with this so-called THAAD system, which was, I guess, like the US's own advanced sort of anti-ballistic missile defense system. And I use defense very loosely here. And the danger here, of course, is one, that it puts US military personnel directly on the ground, like I think 100 or so are being dispatched to operate this. It just highlights once again that the US is a co-belligerent in this, in every aspect, and it has been from the beginning. And I mean, analysts are kind of divided on the implications of this. On the one hand, some have argued that this was in a way of convincing the Israelis to not target Iran's nuclear enrichment sort of infrastructure or refineries. So it was in a sense a bribe, in essence, despite the fact that they've given now, I think, more 22, 23 billion in US military assistance already, when Iran's military budget as a whole, I think, is like just over 10 billion in 2023. So there's that, and some others have argued that actually it reduces the sort of, it basically almost incentivizes Netanyahu actually to be even more aggressive and go even bigger in terms of the attack on Iran. So I mean, obviously we're not party to these things, and we can't. It's hard to fully gauge. It does seem that I mean, and there was also just a recent report that I read that the US obviously is extensively spying on the Israelis too, like the NSA and so on. And they themselves have some idea of what Israel might target, but they themselves aren't fully sure either. So I think it can go one of two ways, and I'm not a clairvoyant, so I would be remiss to not sort of preface that or caveat that. But it does seem that maybe it has caused the Israelis to maybe be less quote unquote ambitious in the strike they would like to launch against Iran and others. But the other problem, of course, is actually Israel's own military capabilities, which I'm certainly not an expert upon, but it does seem very clearly, both True Promise 1 and 2, that Israel can't defend itself without basically an international coalition helping it do so, as well as obviously the constant injection of new armaments, ammunitions, and so on. So it's very much dependent in that respect itself. So that's another part of the debate. Like, I think it's long been said by an analyst that Israel can in no way put a serious dent in Iran's kind of nuclear sites by itself. It would need 100% like United States support, and the United States would basically have to carry it out. But surely, yeah, they probably are certainly capable of targeting through cyber attacks, through obviously various different targeted bombings, vital infrastructure in Iran. And I guess they've been, it does seem that they've been debating over the last couple of weeks what's the best, in their view, of course, the best sort of course of action. And obviously we're weeks away from an American election. So there has also this debate about to what extent Netanyahu wants. Obviously, it does seem clear that he would prefer a Trump administration, despite being given pretty much everything he needs by the Biden administration. But he doesn't necessarily want to be perceived to have swung the election in Trump's favor so explicitly, even though I think it's pretty hard to deny if Trump wins that is a big part of it. But obviously, the Americans have the Democrats only have themselves to blame there for the kind of the full-throated, unqualified support they've given to the Israeli military.
Well, let's maybe take that as the last question, if you don't mind, the upcoming elections, because the Biden administration quite courageously a few days ago gave Israel an ultimatum. This was about a week ago or so, that they have 30 days to allow assistance to come into northern Gaza, or there's going to be consequences. Of course, those 30 days put us after the election. So, a testimony to the courage of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
But in terms of there's a lot of discussion, obviously, in the US all the time about, is there a difference in the foreign policies of the two administrations? And we know quite clearly Israel prefers a Trump administration, despite everything you said. And we all know about the full support that they've gotten so far from the Biden administration. But I'm interested in hearing your analysis, and also interested in understanding, given your knowledge about discussions within Iran and at least public discussions, is there a sense there that it does make a difference, both from kind of narrow Iranian interest, but also in terms of the broader where the region might be going?
Yeah, so obviously it was the Obama administration that sort of took, I would say, quite, it was from sort of the American, from the perspective of the American empire, it was a quite unusual position, given the various different kind of systemic kind of dynamics at work in like the American state and how that feeds into US policy making. The Americans kind of, I guess, spearheading the JCPOA with as part of the P5+1, and reaching this accord was a significant gain. But as it just didn't last, and Trump reneged on it, as I said. And then his cabinet was, and also national security staff were just chock full of like neoconservative, not a technical term, but like warmongers, pretty much, like Mike Pompeo, of course, John Bolton, who literally has just been fantasizing about bombing Iran and attacking Iran for, I don't know, at this point it must be like 2 decades or more. There's obviously, in the case of Trump, seems pretty much in the pocket of, or very much beholden to maybe is a better word, Shelton Adelson, who famously, has said all sorts of horrendous things regarding the region, but he famously said that, the US should use a nuclear weapon against Iran. And obviously he's passed on, but his widow has very much continued and seems willing to continue his legacy. And obviously we have, in the case of actually looking at Palestine specifically, or occupied Golan Heights, he was willing to absolutely just give them pretty much anything they want. Also, I mean, in the Trump era, very much escalated things in Saudi Arabia. Of course, that conflict, the Saudi war on Yemen was very much, green lighted by the Obama administration in the first place. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a difficult one, because obviously Trump then, like I said, reneged on the nuclear deal and then imposed these kind of basically comprehensive sanctions, launched full-out economic warfare against Iran. But then, Biden just continued that policy and actually has added more sanctions since. So I just think there's just deeper systemic, drivers which are preventing kind of any sort of even just engagement with Iran. I mean, this is sort of the unfortunate timing of Pezeshkian's government. Really, there's just absolutely nobody, either Democrat or Republican, who's willing to spend an ounce of political capital to engage Iran. I mean, most recently, Harris was actually asked about who do you think is the biggest sort of threat, national security to the United States, and she said Iran. I mean, Iran, like a middle power in the Middle East, and so not China, not Russia, not other things, not maybe various other things that one could actually point to. She pointed directly to Iran, which again, it shows that she will most likely just continue this very hawkish policy. The only difference I see, and so I obviously discuss this sometimes with friends in the United States, and I don't pretend that there's not trade-offs in each case, and it's necessarily an easy decision and versus domestic versus the foreign policy. I see the foreign policy, they're generally quite unified, really, and I think there is like a bipartisan, basically, uniparty on these things. The only difference I see is that we have seen the Biden administration make some efforts to just stop the kind of regionalization of the. I mean, this is extension to Iran fully, and to enter and get dragged into a war with Iran. But they're not willing to stop an Israeli attack on Iran. They're not willing to do anything meaningful to chastise or tell off anything punitive after the Israelis attack, the Iranian consulate, and so on and so forth. They're not willing to do anything really meaningful in that regard. So, and again, I don't think like the Biden administration, it's not that they don't necessarily want a war with Iran because they care about Iran or the Iranian people or anything. They just know that Iran has much more ability to impose a heavy cost upon its regional allies in the Gulf and elsewhere, and also like the US, bases across the region and assets across the region. So, I mean, and you can see that hubris like really at work. I mean, you saw it at the amongst the Israelis, but I think a lot of American politicians also gave voice to it. They sort of said, "Oh, we've taken out quote unquote Hamas, and now Hezbollah is in this situation," which of course Hezbollah has shown to be actually quite the contrary. But they're severely weakened. So we should now go for the head, for the octopus. Basically, we've cut off the tentacles, and now we can go. Which obviously is a this complete misunderstanding of how any of these relationships actually work and how they work in a very networked and decentralized way. But there is that hubris there, and it's been echoed both by Republican and Democratic politicians. The only thing, I guess, which is a concern is that Trump is just more of a wild card, and he could do something really, really shocking and drastic, which then could have all of these unforeseen circumstances. So, I mean, it's a difficult one, and I really don't envy anybody having to vote in that election. I mean, at all. But yeah, I think they both have their problems, and any kind of illusions about a future Harris administration, I think, should be just cast aside, and it needs to be understood that they're really, like you said, I mean, they welcomed an endorsement from Dick Cheney, for crying out loud, who also was very much part of the regime change bandwagon, has long had his sights on Iran. And if they're willing to welcome that sort of caliber of person into their campaign, it tells you a lot about, at least on foreign policy issues, where they're going to, where they're going to stand, and the fact that they just really don't have any convictions. I do see, like, Obama, for all of his vices and all of his problems, he did actually see like some. He did see there was even an imperial rationale for actually reconcile to some extent Iran and then moving eastwards and focusing on China. Whereas I think the current Democratic establishment don't even necessarily, that is obviously part of the puzzle, but they're not willing to de-escalate in Iran. They've actually seen, the most devastating sort of catastrophe unleashed upon the region, maybe since the Nakba, for many, 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 decades. So, like I said, it's not an easy choice, and they're really both tragic, really, and awful.
Both really tragic and awful. We'll end on that note, unfortunately, but that's the reality. And thank you so much, Eskandar, for joining us and for this great analysis. There's a lot of points that we'd love to follow up on, but we'll leave it for another time. And meanwhile, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.